Welcome back to yet another episode of your Re-Educated podcast. Today, for episode 3 of season 9. We have a very special guest, Derek Matravers. He is a philosopher whose work spans aesthetics, ethics, and the philosophy of mind, with particular depth in the emotional experience of art and the nature of fiction. Currently professor of philosophy at the Open University and a fellow of Churchill College, Cambridge. He is known for his precise, analytically rigorous approach to questions that sit at the heart of how and why we engage with art. From painting and literature to music and film, his research investigates how emotional responses to fictional characters and narratives can both be genuine and philosophically puzzling. He also explores how art intersects with morality, imagination, and the structure of mental states. How are you doing today?
I'm very well, thanks, Catherine. It's very nice to be here.
I'm really excited for today's conversation. It's been really exciting. And honestly, I've been talking a lot on this season about this particular book that I'm reading right now called Martyr. I don't know if you've ever heard of it, but it is a phenomenal book by Kaveh Akbar. And I have re-fallen in love with fiction, and it's been a while, so I'm excited. Quick question, what is the first book that got you super fascinated with fiction?
With fiction, actually, it's probably Scott Fitzgerald, probably The Great Gatsby, just
Wow. When
because
did you read that?
I must have been about 17 or 18. It's just it's a book that seems so simple, and yet the structure is so complicated, and it's just there is so much in it to think about. So I
Yeah.
think that was the one that really made me ta take fiction seriously as an art.
What do you feel like it was about that particular book compared to everything else you had read before that suddenly changed something?
That's a good question. I think it was that it has such a strong perspective, a narrator's perspective, but yet the world is reflected on from other perspectives. And then there's the growing character of Gatsby, and you've got to try. So it develops, and you don't quite know what to think about him. And then it's just so neat. It's like a little. I mean, it is a perfectly put together book, I think. And it's
Mm,
also got very deep and interesting themes about love and death, and so yeah, and
so many, yeah.
Also Scott Fitzgerald's such a it's difficult to read his books without thinking a bit about his life, and he's such a kind of romantic character and interesting character.
Mm. Yeah, I remember I loved Harry Potter growing up. I think that really helped me find my love for reading. And then schooling kind of did its thing and I stopped reading completely. And then in college, I super randomly came across this book called The Man in Full by I'm not going to remember. It was an amazing book, but the reason I felt so connected to that was it was the first time I felt like I was able to leave my own shoes and step into this other world. And in that but it didn't feel like a form of escapism. And I think that was a really key piece for me. It wasn't like I was escaping into a different world to like run away from my problems, but it felt like I was stepping into this other world to then see the problems that I have in my own life through a different lens. And so it was actually really revelatory in that way that it was helping me while I was being entertained, which usually entertainment doesn't do. And so what is that about fiction that sometimes create those worlds that you're able to connect with your own life?
I think that does make I think that does pinpoint a big difference between um, it's too strong to say two sorts of stories. But Iris Murdoch, who was a figure in Oxford in the 50s and 60s, who was both a philosopher and a novelist, very successful novelist, very successful philosopher. And she said that that good art works against the ego, is not egotistical. So good art doesn't allow you to be as egotistical. It doesn't allow you to take these kind of flights of fancy that make you feel better about yourself. But what it does is it does exactly what you just said, is kind of turns the gaze in on yourself so that you can look at yourself. And if it's a good book, or then you look at yourself truly and and learn. And so I think and since reading Murdoch on that, I now read, whenever I'm reading a novel, I have that sort of voice in my head. Because sometimes with some, I mean, to be honest, I'm quite also as well if it's Gerald fan, I'm also a bit of a Hemingway fan. But so, sometimes you read Hemingway and you think, oh, yeah, there's another fishing trip, and it is you just feel a little bit as if Hemingway is kind of working out his egotistical problems, and that I think makes the book a worse book. I think Murdoch's right in that good art works against the ego, both from the creators and the reader's point of view.
Hmm. So after finding The Great Gatsby, what kind of led your journey into being fascinated and wanting to work in understanding the experience of art and also the nature of fiction?
I was I love art. I've always liked art and particularly the visual arts actually rather than more than actually that's not true. No, books as well as visual arts. But it's different skill sets really. I found myself thinking more about the problems about art than actually doing thinking about the art itself. I'm not no good at producing works of art. I'm not a good painter, not a good creative writer. Um, so it was the only option left over to me, really. I have skills as a philosopher and as a thinker. So they're just applying those skills to art.
Hmm. Which I guess then the first question really is, what is an art? Because I think a few of the conversations we've been having so far, I mean, it's just fascinating how understanding how somebody defines art for themselves really reveals a lot about them and their relationship with the world around them. And I didn't realize that until this season. And I'm like, it's quite profound. Like art actually plays a really integral life in a person's life and also in a society. And I think I've been really excited to just really get into that world and understand philosophically why people's relationship with art matter. So,
That's
yeah.
interesting. Yeah. The in a way, the history of the question of what is art in the past 50 years has been, in some ways, it's been interesting, but in other ways, it's been a little bit depressing. So, um, with the history of the avant-garde in the 20th century, so the standard story sort of goes that back in 1900, we all basically knew what art was. So paintings looked like what they were supposed to be paintings of. They were visually attractive. Novels were all kind of you could read them and they would transported you to another world. And then people like Picasso came along and the conceptual artists came along and also the experimental writers, postmodern writers, and you could no longer rely on these things. So then the question became, well, okay, now we've lost a sense of where the boundaries of art are. What are we going to, how are we going to, what are we going to do about this? And then philosophy went through various phases of asking this question and ended up roughly with the solution is that basically it's art if you call it art, if it's endorsed as art, which sort of makes sense in that it doesn't exclude anything and it looks as if nothing could be excluded. But it's not a very interesting answer to the question. And then there's been some other work which has been going on slightly more quietly, where philosophy's been looking at particularly work in early hominids and the development of minds. I know you had Adrian Curry on your podcast not too long ago, and he works in this kind of area. And the thought might be that there is that human beings everywhere, all cultures have a kind of practice for producing things which have aesthetic properties non-accidentally. So we can look at some pots, baskets, whatever, from cultures vastly different to ourselves, and we can recognize them as being part of a similar practice to a practice that we have. It would be too silly. It would you couldn't identify those things, the outputs of those practices as art, because that means you would just rule out all the kind of interesting stuff that was done in the 20th and early 21st century about people trying to sort of do this, to expand the concept of art with conceptual art, etc. But nonetheless, I think it'd be a pity to lose um, sight of the fact that we are, uh, as a species, we seem to produce things which it does make sense to group together um, as I don't know, as intentional aesthetic objects or something like that. And that has something to do with our category of art. Our category of art is broader than that, But it would be a pity to lose sight by chasing down the avant-garde and trying to make sure that the avant-garde piece is all right. It'd be a pity to lose sight of the fact that there is this core which seems to serve some kind of biological or psychological need. So
Hmm.
I've got more interested in that recently.
Where do you think, I mean, it's actually so interesting. Where do you think the desire to define what art is even comes from?
I think, well, I mean, partly it's philosophers' mania for defining things, but then, but I think it does have a respectable root because if you say to somebody, look, this is a camel, then they know what you're saying because we all know what a camel is. So you can say, so that's a sentence that conveys information. It has content. But if you say to somebody, this is a wumph or something, and nobody knows what a wumph is, and a wumph has no definition, then you're not actually conveying any information. You're not saying
Yes.
anything. So if people think that there really is a question about whether stuff is art or isn't art, or you think the claim that pointing at something and saying, yeah, that's art is conveying information, then it looks as if we must know roughly what art is, otherwise no information would be being conveyed. And then the search for a definition is just pushing that a bit further down the road and saying, well, if we must know what art is and for information to be conveyed, then there must be something we can say about what art is, and then that's the search for a definition.
Mm. It's interesting because I feel that where I'm currently at is the place where you're like, okay, art is everything. You could live artistically, you can, but the reason I feel like I've gotten to that point is when I was growing up, the definition of artist was super boxed in. So it was you had to be a painter, or you had to be a drawer. In my head, those were the only two. If you played an instrument, you were a musician, you were an artist. But I think having these interviews, like these conversations to me are deeply creative. And I find having questions about the world and finding people who speak about it and exploring it open-endedly is a very artistic process for me. But I want to call myself an artist, but I'm not. But there are other things I do, I think, that are artistic, but it seems like such a difficult word to be able to do unless you're like a painter. Or so it's interesting because I feel like maybe that kind of expansion of the definition came from a lot of people maybe not feeling like they were part of that group, even though they were. Like, I guess what I'm trying to say is, I think about this often as like words for professions, for example. Like saying I'm a mathematician means that whatever I'm getting paid to do professionally, I'm doing math for that. But I think what people mistake that with is that if I'm not a mathematician, I don't need math, which is in the sense that we all use math on a daily basis. And in that sense, we are all mathematicians, but we need a different label to say professionally, I do these things. And I think in that sense, we are all artists, but that's different than doing it for a career or for payment, you know?
That's it. Yeah, that seems that seems right. I mean, you could just maybe like mathematician as well, maybe, and certainly like philosopher. I mean, that's true of philosophy more than anything, surely. That I'm a professional paid up philosopher, but that doesn't make me more of a philosopher than somebody who's not a professional paid up philosopher. They can think more deeply, as deeply as me, no problem. Um, but maybe it'd be worth distinguishing between art, a kind of high art, the practice of art that gets involved in the galleries and so on and so forth, and just something. And then there's to use a phrase used by a Canadian philosopher, Dominic Lopez. They're kind of practices of appreciation. So there are many practices of appreciation. Lopez's recent work, I think, is really interesting in this area. What he wants to say is, look, let's just not worry about the classification of art too much. He doesn't want to do away with it. He thinks it does some useful work, but he says think much more about the practices that contribute to, in broad terms, beauty in the world. So he's thinking about things like gardening, even saving computer games as one of the things he talks about. There are all these practices where people are expert in these practices and they can make moves in those practices that are achievements. A lot of them are closely linked to the old categories of art. A lot of them are just merely aesthetic. And what he wants to say is, don't let's. The problem with the old category of art is it put these practices of appreciation in a hierarchy, And we ought to try and just get away from that and get like that. Just realize that these practices of appreciation just sit alongside each other. There's no reason to stack them in a hierarchy. Stuff you're doing on your podcast, certainly aesthetic, it's a practice. There's appreciation involved, there's achievement involved. Is it art? What Lopez wants to say is it's not really a question that validates it or doesn't validate it. It's fine on its own. It's got its own normative rules, its own rules of what achievement is within the practice, own motivations within that practice. And I sort of like that view. It's a kind of democratization of the field.
Hmm. Something I'm really excited to talk to you about is fiction and the feelings that fiction can sometimes bring within us. The first thing I want to ask is, I mean, one, it's fascinating that even though we are conscious that we are just reading a book, that it's not, if we're watching a movie, we know that it's not something that's actually happening with it around us, but we can feel so deeply. We can cry, we can laugh. What is it that's happening in our brains that make us feel like we're actually there?
Yeah. Actually, I think you've put your finger on the right contrast, which is the contrast between reading a book, watching a movie on the one side, and face-to-face experiences, real life on the other side. So, for example, if you imagine now that um, a wolf suddenly runs into the room in which you're in, okay, you're get your actually your body is quite well equipped to cope with this because your legs can take you away from the wolf, your arms you can pick up chairs to hit the wolf with, your eyes will tell you where the wolf is, emotions will kick in. They actually have a big evolutionary function because fear will generate adrenaline, which will help you run faster, etc. So when we have face-to-face experiences, we have behaviors and we have ways of getting knowledge about our environment, our immediate environment, and emotions really have a home there. But then when we're talking about reading about stuff or looking at a movie, so say you've got a picture of a wolf in your room. It makes no sense. It seems to make no sense to fear the picture of a wolf. I mean, a picture of a wolf has never done anybody any harm, like a wolf has done people harm. So there's a big difference between being face to face with a wolf and being face to face with the representation of the wolf. And representations in themselves are not threatening. So why would we fear the wolf in a representation? Wolf representations are not dangerous. And so I think that's right. I think that's the big contrast. It's a very interesting question as to why we feel emotions towards things in representations. But I think that's got confused with another question, which is um, do those representations necessarily have to be fictional? And I don't think that they do necessarily have to be fictional. So I differ from a number of my colleagues. So the question they pose is why do we feel emotions for fictions? Well, the way I would think of it is, well, why do we feel emotions for represented objects? It doesn't seem to me to matter very much whether the picture in our room is a picture of an actual, of a wolf that once lived nearby, or a picture that somebody's drawn of just a wolf they've made up. Neither of those things are going to do you any harm. Neither of those things doesn't make much prima facie sense for us to feel an emotion towards. So there's a question about why we feel emotions towards representations at all. And then there's your question, which is a good question, which is so okay, let's accept all that's true. Still, why is it that some representations do cause us to cry? Even might even arouse fear in us. Um, and that surely has to do with the quality of the representation, whether the story can transport us to another world. And fictions that can transport us to fictional worlds where the things that are happening in those worlds justify our emotional reactions. Um, that's what writing good fiction. Well, not necessarily good fiction because you can get terrible fictions that are tear jerkers. But one of the techniques of fiction, is to transport you to a world and get you to feel emotions within that world.
Yeah, I mean, I'm curious. I'm gonna put forward a not well-formed thought, but I'm gonna try to piece it together. I grew up in a culture at home that was very different than the culture that I grew up in the US. And so if I was to explain some of the traditions that were happening at home, it would seem quite intense, or it would seem magical to someone else that I was talking to. I guess what I'm trying to say is that, but when you see that, you realize what really is the difference between fiction and what we actually live? Because I think sometimes when we experience something, we give a certain sense of like meaning and understanding of the experience. And we're like, all right, it makes sense because of all of these. This is how it's supposed to go down for these reasons. But all you're doing is you're constructing some sort of path of understanding to then make that make sense. In the same way, is that not what we're doing with fiction as well? Like, if I'm reading a book, why can't it be as real as some societal made up thing that only exists for 100 years? I don't know, you know?
Yeah. I mean, I suppose understanding events is finding patterns in them and finding rationals too strong, finding comprehensible patterns in them. What fictions can do is they give us a world, and they give us a world that they try and make comprehensible to us. I'm not, putting aside various bits of postmodern fiction. They try and make this world. They give us a world. They give us a way through it. Sometimes the ways through it are very uncomfortable. So reading, Anna Karenina is not a comfortable thing to do, although it's an extremely rich and learning thing to do. Um, but when we're faced with states, you're quite right. When we're faced with states of affairs in real life, that's what we're trying to understand the world. We're trying to see patterns in it, to make sense of it, to see it as predictable. Um, so I guess what representations can do is that they can, I don't know, sort of tool us up as pattern finding animals in a way that gives us these capacities that might help us find patterns and understand things when we get them in real life. But you're quite right. You come
Hmm.
across different cultural um, episodes, and you sometimes you just can't make you look at it and you just can't make much sense of it. And then if we do tend to look at things as narratives. We look at the real world as narratives. Maybe you think of our own lives as narratives, and then you try and make narrative sense of it. And that's obviously trying to make narrative sense. If we're trying to make sense of our lives through narrative, and we're trying to make sense of fictions and even non-fictions through narrative, then that's going to have overlapping things that we're drawing on, I think.
Which is fascinating. I mean, it's interesting because I think I grew up in a community where the appreciation for art was basically non-existent. But I think to this day, how much I learned through movies, and I mean, I can't imagine what my life would have looked like if I didn't watch those movies. Growing up in a country around all other immigrants, I pretty much designed what it meant to be American by watching movies and listening to music. It's so without it plays such a huge role that sometimes they integrate, like you said, the overlap is so strong that I can't really even determine how much of my experience is because of movies and then how much my experience of, movies is because of my
Yeah,
world. They both are pretty much, they become so one and the same. And it's fascinating the impact art can have in that way.
yeah. I mean, that's true. I think um, the the worry. I mean, there is, and that is normally helpful. I'm sure that's right. There's a slight concern that some of the things that we might pick up from narratives, either fictional or non-fictional narratives, and then we think that we'd read them back into real life, and sometimes that might be a bit dangerous. So take, for example, you mentioned American films. So maybe in 50s and 60s American films, it's an example from Kendall Walton. He says that in those films, if there was a family sitting around a table with a checkered tablecloth, that kind of signaled that they were poor but honest. Okay. So then there's these various conventions you get in fictions. Standardly in old westerns, the guys with the black hats were the baddies, and the guys with the good hats, the white hats were the goodies. And the worry is that we might just internalize these conventions. So we go round to somebody's house and we see they've got a checkered tablecloth, and we think, oh yeah, they're poor but honest people. And of course, they might be, crooks trying to nick our wallet. Or we meet somebody with a white hat and we trust them more than we ought to trust them because we're kind of enculturated to think that people with white hats are the good guys. So there's kind of fixed. So we might worry that they're narrativizing tendencies that are all right in narrative when we meet them in representations, but if we transport them uncritically into our actual lives, those narrativizing tendencies or fictionalizing tendencies might trip us up.
Hmm. And I guess how would someone even study that? How would you go about studying what is I mean, because I remember for a long time the discussion around Call of Duty and a lot of these first person shooters is that a lot of the gun violence that we see is because of these video games. We need to like limit but how would someone even go about studying whether it is in which direction that cause might be happening? Is it that people are already interested in
Yeah.
it, so the films represent that, or is it the other way?
I think where it does bite actually is in the role that narrative plays in therapies. So there's I mean, I'm going to speak in a very broad sense here. But and a lot of the interesting stuff is in the detail, and I won't be able to just give you the detail. But let's just say that that part of treating somebody who's got a disorder might be to get them to tell the narrative of their life. Okay, so narratives do seem to play quite a big role in therapy. Now, here's a danger which I think some people have investigated, is that when we read fictions and even some non-fictions, there tends to be a narrative arc. So we see these fictions as as the stuff in the fiction being meaningful. So in a novel, if somebody is struck by a tile falling from a roof or something, that might be part of a narrative arc that makes sense. Now, it might be that in someone's life, somebody close to them is just struck down by a tile that falls from a roof. And they might say, well, they might then say, when constructing the narrative as part of trying to make themselves to get over this, they might say, well, what did that mean? And the trouble is, that's a question that makes much more sense when you're thinking about a narrative in a book, a fiction or a non-fiction, than it does in real life. Because it just might not mean anything. It just might mean it doesn't mean anything. The guy just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time and he was hit in the head with a tile. And questions like, how can I get closure from this? Well, closure is a narrative property, and that's a property of narratives, not necessarily a property of lives. And it might do people harm to worry too much
To
about what
think
these
about
things
your life as a
mean.
narrative.
Narrative, yeah. And you might think you're stuck you might identify with a tragic figure, or you might see your life as
Mm,
having a kind of being in the genre of tragedy, and that might make it more difficult for you to see things clearly. So I think
wow.
thinking of your life in narrative terms, because narratives are so strong and we pick up all these tendencies of narrative in books that we read, can sometimes not do us any good.
Wow. I mean, I was recently listening to something that was talking a lot about Franz Kafka and a lot of his works, and particularly for how a lot of his works doesn't seem to have this linear progression of a narrative. You'll just randomly have these different characters thrown, and you'll observe something completely chaotic, not because it means anything, but because, like you said, that's a lot more representative of what life feels like but it is so interesting because I think as I've been watching more film and reading more, I have also been trying to cram my life into some sort of like narrative, like a story. Like I'm on a journey, I'm on an adventure. It means something.
Right.
But what do you think? And this is really interesting as well because I run a film club and we watch films from different countries. And we've noticed that some countries create movies that don't seem to have any like clear plot with a end goal, and every interpretation has differed so much of the same film. But other countries happen to have films that are very plot driven. There is only one really interpretation of the film, and you can leave feeling like, oh, all right, the good people won, and we're all good to go home now. Do you feel like those differences in media or art then shapes how people kind of create those narratives for themselves, or whether they even do?
I mean, it would be good if they could. There's a young philosopher called Alice Halberd who's just been making this point. And she looks at the problem that I've just been talking about, where what I've been saying basically is that if people get a simple conception of narrative from books and films and they apply that to their lives, they might trip up. You know, that might be bad for them. Alice makes the reverse point, which is the one that you've just made yourself, which is that, well, if we get people to think about complex narratives and not simple narratives, then that actually might help them in their lives, even if their lives are very complex and not particularly narratively structured. Because there are plenty of, as you quite rightly say, there are plenty of narratives out there, both films and books, in which there's discontinuities, there's not resolution, there's stuff that happens that might just not be meaningful, that can't be fitted in. So if we get better at interpreting and living with those narratives, those might be the narratives to think about in thinking about our own lives, rather than narratives that just, as you say, have a kind of simple, that are plot driven, you know, the good end happily and the bad unhappily, and it's all resolved in the end. Because that, you know, life is not going. You're going to be disappointed if that's the narrative of your life that you want to lead. So I think
Mm,
so. There's two. I think it can be looked at in both ways. Either you think either there's a danger in too simple conception of narrative, making our conception of ourselves too simple, or we're complicated, and therefore we should look at these more complicated narratives in order to understand ourselves better. So yeah, don't write off narratives just because we've been focusing on simple narratives. I think is the moral there.
mm. I mean, I have a personal question for you because you work in this, how has that impacted the way you lead your own life and create meaning? And if you, yeah, I mean, how does that work? Because I guess I can't. I have been so addicted to my narrative, and I've built this narrative of like, okay, I'm doing all this stuff for education. I'm gonna one day write this book that people. I have this narrative in my mind. I know it's crazy, but it gives me something to wake up for every day, and I'll take that. But the truth is, all of that is, it's a dream. It's a fantasy. I mean, I could die today. Like it's not something that like is going to happen. But how do you then? What do you replace that void with then?
Yeah, I'm a bit confused by this debate, but there's a philosopher called Galen Strawson who claims that his life does not have any sort of narrative. He calls himself an episodic. So he says he just had his life is lived in these disconnected episodes. I don't think he's obviously not fibbing. He is truthfully reporting the way life seems to him. But I find that very difficult to grasp because if we don't connect the episodes that we've lived in some kind of narrative, I can't, if I don't own something that I did 5 years ago as mine now, then I don't see how I can feel responsible for it. And say what I did 5 years ago was really mean. It seems that then now I'm kind of responsible for repairing it in some way, for compensating is the wrong word, but for say at least apologizing to whoever it was that I affected 5 years ago. And I can't and so I do own so I don't think I can make sense of my life unless I think of myself as owning all these things that have happened to me in the past. And as you know, like you, I would find it difficult to get up in the morning if I didn't have some kind of anticipations of stuff that I wanted to have in the future. And that just does look to me like a narrative structure to life. I mean, I don't think it has to be one has to think of oneself as being written by Kafka or somebody. Well, at least one hopes not. Not by Kafka, maybe by Fitzgerald. But it doesn't have to be as strong as that. You've got these events that have happened in sequence. You own them all. That means that you know you've been on all of them. They kind of make some sense when you string them together. There's a direction. That just looks to me like a narrative. So I am confused by Strawson's claim because in a way, I don't think we can evade thinking of our lives in narrative form in some way.
I actually I don't know the full details, but it was something that someone was telling me recently about how there was an indigenous population in Peru, I believe, that views the future as behind them and the past as in front of them. And
Right.
I wanted to read more about it. I didn't have time to, but I was just so fascinated to even hear that that's even a possible way of thinking about things, right? Because it's like narrative also has a very specific linear temporal kind of structure of where the future is always in front and it kind of you
Yeah.
walk towards it. It would be really interesting if we looked at narratives as kind of like loop-de-loop maybe or circles. Like even a narrative that goes in circles would look so different, right? I mean, it's
Um,
rather than something that's just progressing upwards. It, and yeah, which and the thing is, fiction and these art pieces are what informs the way you even think about narrative, which means it plays a deeply profound role in the way that you understand your life, which is crazy.
yeah, it is. I agree. It's difficult for me to get my head around the Peruvians that you've described. I guess because we think about, and there must be something right about this. We think about the past as fixed. Science fiction aside, we can't go back and change stuff, and we think about the future as open. You know, what I do tomorrow is not fixed in the way that what I did yesterday is fixed. Um, and I suppose another danger of narrative is that even if you're on page 120 of a 300-page novel, you know that what has come ahead is already written. But in our lives, we hope to quote the line from Lawrence of Arabia, we hope nothing is written yet.
Mm.
We hope to be able to write it ourselves.
There's this film called New York Syndicate. Have you seen it?
I have not, no.
Oh, okay, but it's a phenomenal philosophy movie, but it's this movie director whose goal is to like extract himself from his life so he can understand himself. So he keeps adding extra and extra characters to this plot to try to get the entire picture of what his life is, to be able to actually understand it from a third person perspective. And there's millions of interpretations to the movies. The way I interpreted it was at the end, he just realized he never could actually fully detach himself from his own perspective of his own life. And what I was going to say is, I think one of the most damaging parts of the narrative approach is that you start to feel like you're really important. You feel like you're at the center. The narrative is floating through you. You are the center of attention, and what happens to you really changes everything. But that is just a limitation of fiction because you can't write every person's perspective that ever shows up. The truest fiction would be 8 billion stories at the same time, and you have to read all 8 billion. But because you can't do that, you only see one, two, three, or four maybe perspectives, and so you have this feeling that okay, these are the people who matter. Everyone else is just like a side character, and I think that really plays a huge role in how people think about themselves as well, where there's this like main character arc or narrative that everyone holds to themselves, which I find to be so damaging.
Yeah.
That I find damaging, not just yeah.
It's not just you, me as well. But yeah, that seems dead right. Um, that film sounds fascinating. I mean, as you say, I'm sure it sounds to me as if it must be a doomed attempt. We can't, yeah, we can't. Kierkegaard, it's a bit like Kierkegaard saying it's a pity that lives have to be lived forward, but can only be understood backwards. We can only understand things by turning around and seeing what we've done, but it's forwards the way we've got to go. But you're right, if you think about our lives as narratives, every narrative has a hero. We're the heroes of our narratives. And the worrying thing is we see everybody else as a bit part player. Yeah, that sounds a good film. That sounds a very interesting
it
idea.
it's just terribly unfortunate because I think the more I realize how not true that is, I'm realizing how disconnected you start navigating the world when you really have this like deep self-importance, which is not to say that you aren't important. It's just to say that everyone is important. Everyone's
Yeah.
this main character in their story. And I think I have not seen a film that really, I think it's impossible. But one thing that I have noticed is a lot of books that come out nowadays are not through the perspective of singular character. I mean, almost every book that we've been reading has somehow just been through perspectives of three or four different people. Every chapter will kind of jump between, and that I think is a very different narrative kind of meta that I'm not sure if it's always existed that way.
Um, I wonder if that's the influence of maybe I've been thinking about this because I recently read Ivanhoe, which is a book by Walter Scott, written in the 18th century, set in the 15th century, and was originally published as a three-volume novel. It's very, very long, and I'm sure that an abridged version would be slightly better than the full scale thing. But the interesting thing about it was it was different from a modern novel in that in exactly the way that you said. It followed different characters, and sometimes something happened to a character, and then the next chapter would begin, and the authorial voice would say, "Oh, now we've just got to go back a week and see what happened to this other character during the week." So the book doesn't follow a linear progression. It actually is just chops and changes in time, just to follow the stories of these various characters. And I was thinking about this, and I thought that's really unlike canonical 20th century novels. But it's more like soap operas. It's more, which soap you turn on a soap opera, and this episode will feature this story from this family. The next week it'll be some other family, etc., etc. So I don't know whether that's um, I don't know whether whether novels just lost taking these multiple perspectives for a bit, and that somehow we're getting back to something that we did before, or oh, I don't know, but I mean, it's certainly, I mean, it's interesting. I don't think, as I say, I don't think it's a uniquely modern phenomenon. I think it was there in the 19th century, um, and yeah, it's healthy in a way, I think.
Yeah, it definitely changes, I think, the relation. Yeah, it's been so interesting. But I've been reading so many books like that that I'm kind of like tired of it, and I'm like excited. I just want to sing. I we read Notes from Underground, and I like missed that kind of just singular main character, just
Right.
feeling like they're super important. I kind of miss that sometimes. I'm like,
Yeah.
because you never get to develop any one character too well, and so. It is
Yeah.
just really fascinating. Another thing I was really excited to ask you about is because I know some of your work is surrounding ethics and the influence of art on ethics. So I was curious how you one made that connection. Like what made you kind of be like, oh, let me try to connect these two things. Because I feel like oftentimes you don't hear about the connection of those two.
Yeah. I mean, if you go back to the ancient Greeks, and I think it was the ancient Greeks, saying that there's truth, beauty, and the good are these three values that are supposed to not intersect. Um, but I suppose there's two big questions one might ask. I mean, the one might be, well, is art part of the good anyway? I mean, so John Ruskin, the great 19th century British writer on art, he really thought that the Gothic was ethical in a way that the stuff that came after the Gothic wasn't ethical. And what he meant by that was that if you were a kind of craftsmen in England in the 1300s or 1400s, and you were making you were using what skills you had and what tools you had, but they weren't very good, but you were making the stuff that went into cathedrals to glorify God. This was a kind of pure and ethical endeavor. It wasn't egotistical, it was in the service of something else. And this was succeeded by the Renaissance, where the art was much more self-aggrandizing. So Ruskin thought that there was an ethical dimension to art, just per se, that the Gothic captured an ethical, would reflected a decent way of being in the world in a way that the Renaissance didn't reflect a decent way of being in the world. That's all. That's a bit more. That's a bit kind of. I think that's an interesting question, but that's a sort of not everyone believes in that link between art and ethics. A kind of a more immediate link between the two is, I mean, if you've been talking about films, if you imagine that somebody wrote a list of the top 10 films and they included the film Birth of a Nation, D.W. Griffith's great epic, I think that would raise eyebrows because Birth of the Nation is an explicitly racist film in which the Ku Klux Klan are portrayed as heroes. Um, and so people will think that's a worse film. So say it was an award just for being a film. So I think people would think that's a worse film for its immoral content. It would have been a better film if it hadn't had a moral content. So there's so the so there's people don't so the thought is this that we don't want to make a judgment. Don't want to just say, look, there's just a judgment as to whether it's a good or bad film, and there's a judgment as to whether it's ethically good or bad. Somehow those two have to be more interestingly linked. And it is quite tricky spelling out exactly what the link is. Different people have different views. I mean, my own view is that that artistic appreciation is somehow uh, somehow internalizing the creative process that went into the work, and that if what you're internalizing is something that's horrible or immoral, then that just makes it a worse work of art. Um, than if it's not. So I think it's a kind of
Mm.
form of dishonesty, I think.
I wonder, I'm thinking about because I mean, I feel like as a child, a lot of my ethical compass probably came from Disney movies. And I'm
Right.
curious if the consumption of art, no matter how apolitical or how, how neutral it tries to be, simply like I think about this all often. In high school, we're given a certain set of books to read. Regardless of the books that they choose, by picking any book, what they're basically making the statement is this is a book worth reading. And the other books, maybe they're worth it, but not as worth as these 10 books that we've given you. So even in just that selection process, you have subtly kind of put an ethical statement about these
Mhm.
books compared to others. And so you would then read whatever comes out of that and say, oh, this is probably like useful, or this is what good art is, or you start making these judgments. So it's impossible to really consume art without also getting the kind of ethics behind the worth of its consumption, right?
Yeah, that seems right. I mean, Plato had the right at the beginning of all this. Plato didn't trust the arts, partly for these reasons. So his worry was that in ancient Greece, we're giving these people these tales. And so they get told Homer and all these tales about the gods. And those are the things that they're supposed to think are good. And that's where they're supposed to get their ethical compass from. And then Plato's worry was if you take any skill, let's take a couple of typically ancient Greek ones, say sandal making or saddle making for horses. If you make a duff sandal, then somebody's going to tell you, and then next time you'll know better to make a good sandal. And the same with, if your saddles keep falling off the horses, somebody's going to tell you, and you're going to sort of learn how to make a better saddle. So um, with most practices, with most craft practices, there's a kind of feedback loop that tells you the truth about sandals or the truth about saddles. But with art, what makes successful art is that it's popular, or is that what makes a successful play in ancient Greece was how much applause it got. And Plato's worry was that there's nothing in what makes a successful play that will point plays, the content of plays towards truth. Okay, because what makes it successful is
Mm,
getting applause, and applause, a false play could give you as much applause as a true play. So there's nothing in the feedback mechanism of art that'll point towards truth. And let's go back to your
mm.
example. So you get given these books, um, and I'm sure you're right that people get their ethical compass from these books. And I think that what Plato's worry would be is, yeah, how do we know that the production of these books were part of a practice that got them pointing towards the ethical truth rather than away from it? And that's actually, although um, I think there's a lot, I think there's actually some quite difficult questions that Plato poses for the link between art and ethics that I don't think we've perfectly answered, to at least we wouldn't have answered to Plato's satisfaction. So I don't think there's anything absolutely central and structured in the production, particularly of fiction, that means that good fiction is going to necessarily be the fiction that's going to point us towards the truth about ethics.
That is so interesting. My dad used to love when he first came to the US, he loved History Channel. I mean, that was his thing. He always gives this example. He's like, when I came to the US, the History Channel had the best shows. And now if I turn it on, it's just about how the aliens abducted this person, about every conspiracy theory, about whether the Earth is flat. He's like, how did this happen? And I think it really does point to what you're saying here, where it's popularity or what people want to watch that drives what art is created and what art is highlighted. It has nothing to do with the truth or any other kind of metric, which can be, yeah, which is I feel like the rise of reality TV with so many different
Mm.
kind of, I feel like yeah, it is really fascinating in that sense. So I mean, what do you think? So what do we do about it?
Um, I think what would be nice is if we could tell by engaging with a work of art whether or not it was truthful. Plato thought we couldn't. Um, I'm optimistic in that I think that with deeply serious works of art, we probably can if we engage with them enough. This this goes back to your question about the link between art and ethics. Can we can we tell something is a bad work of art, even in the sense of being bad for us, by really, really understanding it properly? And if you think about paintings are probably the better example of this than novels. So say, take a portrait painter. So a really good portrait painter is so Lucian Freud, horrible man, but amazing portrait painter in the UK in the late 20th century, early 21st century. He would take months and months and months and months to get to paint a portrait, maybe even years. And he was trying to get it right. He's trying to reveal the sitter's psychology on the surface of the painting. And the hope is that you can look at one of these portraits and you could actually um, learn something about the psychology of the sitter and also learn something about Lucian Freud's views about the psychology of the sitter. And then you can make up your own mind. Um, when I can't remember his name now, but when it'll come back to me, this great English portrait painter painted a picture of Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill's wife looked at the painting and saw revealed in it the painter's view of Churchill's character, and the view was not a flattering one. It was not a good one. And in fact, nobody quite knows what happened to that painting, but the thought is she had it destroyed. And the thought was it's revealing something about Churchill, something true about Churchill that she didn't want revealed. So the thought is that there's Plato's right. There's going to be plenty of art out there that's pointed to the truth and art that's not pointed to the truth. And the hope is that by really, really deeply engaging with a work of art, we might be able to tell ourselves whether it's an honest work of art, whether it's taking us to the heart of something or not. But that's hard
Hmm.
work. I mean, I don't think that's stuff you can do very easily.
What are some books or movies you can think of that did that well for you?
Wow. I mean, actually, it's going to be a controversial answer. I think that so Paul Gauguin, who went to um, Tahiti and spread venereal disease there and married underage girls and was generally a horrible man. Um, but his paintings that he did there, um, I think the wrong reaction to go to think to Gauguin's acknowledged ethical faults is to think that we shouldn't look at his paintings, because I think that knowing the stuff that we do about Gauguin, you can look at the paintings, and in a way, you can see all kinds of things. Like you can see his attitude to him having moved from Paris to, in quotes, the primitive world. You can see some thoughts about colonialism. You can see in the main thoughts about trying to get out of the dead end of impressionism, which was also something he was struggling to do. And you can also see some of his thoughts about sexuality and his own attraction to his models and so on and so forth. And so what you get is this incredibly complicated, amazingly complicated world view when you're looking at Gauguin, much of which is ethically rebarbative. But it's there in the paintings, and you can then make the judgment yourself. Um, uh, I mean, I think the worry about Gauguin's paintings is that they think that people will, in a way, I don't know, treat them as I don't know what the worry is really, kind of fully articulated, but um, but I think that they're too interesting to put behind closed doors, really.
Mhm. I recently came across this painting called Death and the Maiden, um,
Yeah.
by I wish but I mean it was one of the first times I had come across a painting that I immediately had to like sit back and just like take a second, and I was like, this is so beautiful. And
Right.
I think sometimes, yeah, I mean, a lot of the conversations we've had so far on this season has been about art appreciation and what it takes to actually develop that sense of patience and attention to really have the beauty of something kind of reveal itself. I'm curious if you have practices in your own day to day that allows you to kind of tap into that appreciation for the different aesthetic things that might exist around you.
I wish I were a better art appreciator. I mean, certainly doing the philosophy of art has helped me do it. I came across a lovely comment the other day by the great art critic Bernard Berenson, um, who was an American, moved to Florence. He was involved in some slightly dodgy practices because he used to authenticate paintings as being by various famous artists, and then their price would shoot up, and then he would get a cut of the price when they were sold. So there's slightly dodgy stuff going on with Berenson, but but I love his writings on art. And he was talking to somebody, and he said, "Oh, remember that old story about hunting with a bow and arrow? Do you see a tree? Don't shoot your arrow. You see the bird in the tree, don't shoot your arrow. You see the eye of the bird in the tree, now you can shoot." And he said that art appreciations like that, you've just got to, you've got to really hone in. Not, I mean,
Mm,
not literally on little tiny details, but you've got to you've got to really, really think, use what you've got, what capacities you have to really think through, see what the intentions are on the surface of the canvas.
mm. I have one a last question that is a personal, curious one, because the word artist and the same as we talked about earlier, the same word philosopher as well, I think to me are these really lofty terms that I would one day like to confidently look at the mirror and say, I am that. Do you remember the process it was for you to like confidently look at the mirror and say, I am a philosopher? And like when did you feel like you had the right to say that? Where I really I yearn for the day where one day I look at myself and I go, you know what, I can actually proudly, confidently know that, I can call myself that. But it's a lot of work. I'm curious for you what that process was like.
Um, I mean, I don't want to sound wet, but I'm afraid just have to say, I'm afraid, you are a philosopher. I think it helps. I think philosophy, it helps slightly. We talk about the definition of art, but notoriously, philosophers are absolutely hopeless at saying what philosophy is. It's not that we haven't tried. My favorite one, a lot of people's favorite one, is the great Cambridge philosopher G.E. Moore from 120 years ago, when somebody said to him, "Well, but just what is philosophy?" And he struggled for a bit. And then eventually he just gestured to his books on his shelf and he said, "I don't know, it's whatever those are about." And that is the best definition of philosophy that I come across. Um, so it helps if there's no definition that's going to pick out a philosopher from somebody who's not a philosopher, then we're thrown back on things like, well, what is philosophy? It's thinking, it's thinking deeply about stuff that matters. And then that's really impossible to link that to something that's a profession, because thinking deeply about stuff that matters is stuff that many people don't do and lots of people do. And some of us are lucky enough to get paid to do it. And I and also I think you would be bonkers if you thought that the people who are lucky enough to get paid to do it somehow had been magically selected as the people who were best at doing it. I think you probably have to be pretty good at doing it to get paid to do it, but there are plenty of people in the world who are better than paid philosophers at philosophy who are not in the profession of philosophy. I think that just has to be true. I don't think anybody could deny that. So I agree it's a discipline in the sense that it's got a profession, it's got a career structure, and so on and so forth. But I don't think that is what philosophy is. I think philosophy has got to be something that is much, much broader than that,
Mhm.
and which
This was a
includes you,
lovely conversation. Yeah, what'd you say?
and which includes you, Gavin,
Yeah.
as
I mean, yeah, it is a very lofty word. I think because it's hard to pin what it is. Same with artists. It's like it seems like such a lofty thing to aim for and to be like I am because it's interesting because the other terms are often just you're an engineer if you work as one. It's really defined. It's pretty clear. Like these are the things that they do. But with artist and with a philosopher, I think both of them are much more open-ended. And so, yeah,
I think that's right. I mean, I think what we shouldn't we must also keep in mind that it can be done well or badly by anybody. Um, so one hopes that professional artists and professional philosophers do it well. Um, they sometimes do it badly. Um, but yeah, I don't think the question is whether you are a philosopher or whether you are an artist. The question is, do you do it well or do you do it badly?
yeah,
Um,
maybe, yeah, maybe that's a better question to ask. Yeah, I mean, this was an amazing conversation. I really enjoyed speaking with you. Thanks for getting on the show.
Gautam, thanks very much for inviting me. I really enjoyed it as well. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah, and I hope to everyone who's listening, you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. I think it was a phenomenal chapter to this season. Keep listening. We have a lot more coming up, and as per usual, stay re-educated.